Good evening. Thank you all very much for joining us here tonight. Maybe some of you expected Dan Benjamin, our president. He's very, very sorry he cannot be here tonight. He's in New York, but I'll try my best to impersonate him a little bit. My name's Anna Ramich. I'm the Vice President and Chief of Staff here at the American Academy, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to tonight's Lloyd Cutler Lecture, Illiberal Human Rights, with a question mark, delivered by our Lloyd Cutler Distinguished Visitor, Gráinne de Búrca. Gráinne, thank you for being here with us, and thank you all. The Lloyd Cutler, warning, I'll be saying Lloyd Cutler a lot, so bear with me. The Lloyd Cutler Distinguished Visitorship at the American Academy was initiated in 2008 in honor of the legacy of one of the American Academy's founding trustees, Lloyd Cutler. For those of you who don't know who Lloyd Cutler was, he was a prominent Washington, D.C. Attorney who co-founded Wilmer Cutler and Pickering, and you may know it now as Wilmer Hale, and welcome to our Wilmer Hale colleagues here in the audience this evening. And he also served as White House counsel to Presidents Carter and Clinton, and he was in the administrations of Presidents Reagan, Johnson, and George W. Bush. When he passed away in 2005, The Atlantic called him the last super lawyer, which sounds like the next Marvel Universe blockbuster, if you ask me. But the distinguished visitorship in his name here at the Academy brings U.S. legal scholars and practitioners of highest renown to Berlin to connect and exchange ideas with their German counterparts, their colleagues, and the interested public like yourselves. Former Lloyd Cutler distinguished visitors include Roberta Cooper Ramos, Stephen Breyer, Linda Greenhouse, and Harold Coe, among many others over the years. And in this inter- and multidisciplinary spirit, it's my honor to introduce you to a wonderful person joining these ranks, this semester's Lloyd Cutler Distinguished Visitor, Gráinne de Búrca. It's a pleasure to have you here with us once again. One of the foremost scholars on EU law and its relationship to national legal systems and international legal order, Gráinne is the Florence Ellenwood Allen Professor of Law at New York University, as well as the faculty director of the Hauser Law School. And as though that were not already enough, she's also the director of the Jean Monnet Center for International and Regional Economic Law and Justice. Prior to her position at NYU, she taught at Columbia Law School and held tenured posts as professor of Harvard and Fordham Law Schools and at the European University Institute in Florence, where she also co-directed the the Academy of European Law, rather. Her main field of research and expertise is European Union law, and she's written widely on questions of constitutional law and governance, human rights and discrimination, and international relations. And the professor of law, Benedict Kingsbury, says about her work, copies of her books sit open on desks from Moscow to Madrid. Her insights into every case, directive, proposal, and parliamentary position paper in the large and complex European legal system are acute and creative. She's a scholar who really knows her field and helps to shape it. She's written or edited 9 books and 50-plus articles and book chapters, and she edits the Oxford Studies in European Law book series. And I'm exhausted just by reading all of that, and I don't know how she does it. We're excited to hear about your work tonight. I've had the chance to speak with you and with your family, and I was surprised at how optimistic you were. I guess in this world today, I expected something much worse. So I look forward to hearing your presentation. And before I start, just a few housekeeping remarks. Gráinne will join us here. She'll give a presentation for about 30 minutes. We'll have an audience Q&A. And if you're here with us, please raise your hand to ask a question. And if you're joining us on Zoom, don't raise your hand. It won't be very useful, but do put your question in the Q&A part of the Zoom. And without further ado, Gráinne, welcome.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Anna. And thank you so much to the Academy for this opportunity to be here for the Lloyd Cutler Fellowship. I've just been here for a few days, but it's given me a taste of what a wonderful time all of the other fellows are having here, what a great intellectual community you have, and what a beautiful place it is to spend time to research and think and just enjoy one another's company. So I'm really grateful for that. And also to Wilmer Hale for its support for the Lloyd Cutler Fellowship. And to everyone who came tonight. There's friends and colleagues in the audience, and it's a real pleasure to see you all. So Anna said that she was surprised at how optimistic I was. That's because she attended another talk where I presented a rather different account. I was talking about the future of the EU and arguing that Europe has entered a post-crisis phase. But the tenor of the talk tonight is maybe a little more somber. And the title I've given the talk is Illiberal Human Rights with a question mark. And so just to explain something about that choice of title. So as we all know, we're living in an era of rising authoritarianism, a very turbulent era in which many states and political systems, even if not resorting to force or military means, are moving further away from liberal democracy, including formerly stable democracies or hybrid democracies. And what we see is that these political systems and their governments, which don't necessarily rely on overt oppression, often use the language of democracy, rule of law and human rights, even while hollowing out those concepts. And this tendency or set of trends, I would say, has given rise to some interesting terms to describe what's taking place that at first sight are a little paradoxical. So just to give an example, illiberal democracy is one. So Fareed Zakaria used that term in the 90s, and it's been embraced by Viktor Orban in Hungary to describe what he claims is Hungary's current democratic system. Another associated paradoxical term like that is authoritarian international law, recently used by Tom Ginsburg of Chicago Law School. And these terms or phrases are paradoxical because we tend to assume that democracies are liberal, that they could or they do or should protect rights and freedoms as well as popular voting systems. And we tend to assume for the most part that modern international law promotes a liberal international order, even if it accommodates autocracies and democracies alike. But so references to authoritarian international law or to an international legal order that furthers the interests of authoritarians and autocracies seems like a puzzle. And so these two oxymorons, illiberal democracy and authoritarian international law, I'm adding a third one, which is illiberal human rights. And so maybe even more so than the term illiberal democracy, the phrase illiberal human rights, I think, seems really oxymoronic. You know, human rights are surely fundamental liberal protections, that they're protections with the human at the centre, and they're often focused on the individual, even though human rights protect group rights and collective rights too. But also human rights seem to be so fundamentally intertwined with the idea of liberties and rights and independent institutions and checks and balances for the realisation that it might seem a bit outlandish to suggest this term. But the reason I'm doing it, the reason I'm suggesting and asking about this idea of illiberal human rights is that I think we're seeing a set of developments taking place in the international human rights system across jurisdictions, across states, in multiple parts of the world, which are aiming to reshape the human rights system in what I identify as a highly illiberal direction. So the title is implicitly asking the question, in light of these developments, whether such a development is logically possible, whether it's possible to have a regime of illiberal human rights, or whether that is a contradiction in terms, and whether what's emerging from these developments is actually something else, more a Potemkin village, and I'll come back to that metaphor again, than an actual one. So I want to make my argument in a number of points, beginning with the basic claim that we have had a strong and broadly accepted human rights system, an international human rights system, since the middle of the last century. For all its weaknesses, its compromises, its blind spots, patchy implementation, misuses, and more, it's been in many ways a fairly robust and strongly institutionalised and broadly legitimated system for the last 70 years or so. It's been adopted and internalised through laws and institutions, legally, politically, by the vast majority of states worldwide, even if to varying degrees and with different kinds of emphasis. It enjoys a significant social recognition and appeal. The idea and the language of human rights remain resilient and popular across multiple kinds of political system and throughout decades of political and social change. The basic framework of the international human rights system is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, followed by the Economic and Social Rights Covenant and the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, as well as a cluster of more specialised human rights treaties on children's rights, women's rights, rights of persons with disabilities, and so on. And there are regional human rights systems. And it's been a fairly strong system in a way that's been enforced, activated and developed by an array of actors, including civil society actors. And it's been one that, even if often honoured in the breach, and even if subjected to the inevitable government hypocrisies and instrumental uses and so on, has rested, I think, on certain core premises. So just to mention these. Universality being the first, the idea that everyone is entitled to assert and claim these rights. Indivisibility being another, the idea that all rights are included in the system, economic and social, civil and political. You can't claim only some. There's a whole array of rights and a commitment. The human rights system requires protection for all of them. Accountability is a third, that states must ensure that these rights are protected and they must account for or answer for them to the extent that they're not. So crucially, the human rights system rests on a core fundamental commitment to equal human dignity, freedom and welfare. So that's the first point. The second point then is that despite this claim that there's a robust, broadly recognised human rights system, nevertheless, human rights have always been a site of considerable contestation and questioning. So most obviously with the Cold War split, of course, some states favoured economic and social rights over civil and political, others the reverse, East and West differing on that. And many states have entered controversial derogations, exceptions, reservations. There have always been controversy over some issues like abortion, tensions between commitments to women's health and their privacy and autonomy versus fetal rights and so on. Racial justice issues were long ignored and neglected by the US and other states within the human rights system, even when there was ample legal provision that could have been used to protect them. And any developments or moves towards including new issues, whether LGBT rights or others, have never really been straightforward. That's always been also a site of challenge and contestation. Some human rights treaties have gained more rapid and easy, signatory and widespread ratification than others. Some categories of rights, like migrant rights and labour rights, have been more contested in some areas than others. And in addition to that kind of contestation over this or that group of rights and so on, there's always been opposition from some actors to the very human rights framework itself. Authoritarian governments or religious states which have rejected many of the premises of a human rights system in favour of state control or church or religious control or some mix of the two. And some states have refused to sign human rights treaties or they've withdrawn from existing ones. So there's been that kind of contestation by rejection or withdrawal also, and not just optional opting in and out. So the third point then I want to make is that yes, we have a broadly settled human rights system. Secondly, it's always been a site of contestation. But the third point is that what's happening in recent years, and this is my argument, is something a bit different. In other words, it's going beyond the normal contestation and challenge that we've always seen in the human rights system over the decades since its inception. So what we're seeing is not just the contestation by a particular state, group of states, regions to certain kinds of rights or derogation, or insisting on certain derogations, but I think a coordinated and concerted set of national and transnational developments which are actively trying to reshape the international human rights system in a different direction, what I call an illiberal direction. So it's not a case of, preferring this or that set of rights or withdrawing from this or that treaty, or the human rights system is a Western imposition, it's rejected. Instead, various sets of actors have been coalescing to what I call to appropriate and reshape the international human rights system as a whole in a highly conservative and illiberal direction. And I'm arguing that there are two broad groups of actors doing this, involved in this set of developments and reshaping. The first, increasingly notable, I think, in recent years, are coalitions of populist and conservative political and religious actors. And here I think the line between the far right and the right, this is something many of us will recognise, has become blurred in recent times. Formerly conservative parties are merging with or working together with far right groups and taking on some of their agenda. Formerly far right movements in turn have shed some of their more extreme or radical past or claims to move more to the political centre and take power. And these coalitions are often, these days, not always, but often to be found in democratic, broadly democratic political systems or backsliding systems, sometimes like Hungary or Turkey, that have moved into authoritarianism, but also in democracies like the US, like Brazil, and elsewhere. And these prominent coalitions of religious and political actors, I think, have been moving together to reshape the international human rights system. And amongst the strategies that they've been using are the following, just to give you a sense of the picture. First is the promotion or attempted prioritisation of the rights of the traditional family. That's a key plank of this set of moves. The second is rejecting or excluding certain groups of rights, in particular LGBTQ plus rights, and marginalising those communities as rights holders. The third is relatedly but distinctly, challenges to many aspects of sex equality and gender equality, including by labelling anti-discrimination law and advocacy for equality as gender ideology, as something dangerous and to be excluded from curricula and defunded and so on, or prohibited, and undermining, revoking or withdrawing from legal instruments that protect against violence against women. So Russia has been particularly to the forefront of these moves with a traditional values agenda in recent decades, and the Orthodox Church and the Russian political leadership have worked kind of closely together in that particular movement. The Russian Orthodox Church has actually been doing it for quite some years, has been intervening before the European Court of Human Rights or getting other actors to intervene to promote a family values and protection for religion agenda there and at the Council of Europe. And the US, under the previous administration, under the Trump administration, introduced a similar move with what was called the Pompeo Commission on, this is a strange term, but unalienable rights. And the intention was to reframe and reorient rights as they were understood in the US and to downgrade equality rights to prioritise religious freedom and property rights. But we've seen similar moves taking place in Hungary under Fidesz, in Turkey under Erdogan, many other parts of Central and Eastern Europe. They've seen alliances of religious and conservative leaders asserting this kind of supposedly renewed understanding of human rights, a true understanding, just like their understanding of the true people. And we've seen it in Brazil under Bolsonaro, the prior administration. There were very clear coalitions of religious and political actors working together. And rather than relying on religious arguments about the sanctity of life, this time using human rights arguments, not using Catholic teachings, but really going head on to use rights discourse and to push for different types of rights and hierarchies of rights. And a little bit less explicit than that set of strategies, I think, by these populist right-wing coalitions are a sort of a strategy of limiting civic space and civic freedom. So by defunding or regulating or even closing down NGOs, limiting their capacity to advocate, especially for some types of rights, sometimes altogether, as in Hungary, but sometimes for certain kinds of rights, like migrant rights in particular and refugee rights. This has happened also in Denmark, not only in Hungary, or for LGBTQ plus rights and others. So that's the first set of actors involved in what I'm claiming is this distinct move to reshape human rights. The second, that's a whole set of actors across regions. The second actor, really, but in coalition with a number of other authoritarian states, is China. And China has moved gradually from what some have described as a defensive and negative approach to human rights to one in which it's been pressing and pursuing a particular vision of an international human rights system, one that avoids mechanisms of external accountability and talks instead of soft cooperative approaches, that prioritises state sovereignty and non-intervention and promotes a vision of economic development while minimising political freedom. And very notably, added to this kind of vision, the substantive vision of the Chinese human rights vision, has been their mobilisation in recent years, really in the last decade, within international organisations and institutions across the UN to gain support, to win votes on particular issues, to propose resolutions encompassing its vision of human rights, and increasingly to nominate candidates to international human rights bodies in leadership positions, but also to UN special rapporteurships and to treaty bodies that monitor human rights treaties. So while the populist illiberal actors, the first group I mentioned, are partnering with religious bodies transnationally and domestically to exclude certain groups and prioritise certain kinds of rights and to emphasise family authority and to de-emphasise gender equality and reproductive rights, China, on the other hand, is challenging international accountability mechanisms, arguing for a cooperative, non-interventionist approach on the part of the global community and mobilising actively within international organisations to nominate its own nationals and to promote this vision. So they're two distinct, but I think interacting in ways, movements, and together that they're leading to a really distinct change in the international human rights system. So the next point, having set out what's happening in my view, might be to respond to the question of whether, well, is it really new? Is it really something distinct? Right? These things are happening. That's without a doubt. But what's the big change? Because China, after all, has promoted a vision of this kind for quite some time, and similarly in many parts of the world, reproductive rights have always been controversial, and other issues have been controversial. And there have actually been attempts to rewrite human rights before: the Organisation of Islamic Countries on a number of occasions, in the Cairo Declaration in 1990, more recently in the Organisation of Islamic Countries Declaration, which was to be presented in 2020 but got derailed by COVID. That's a declaration of human rights prioritising religious freedom, excluding gender, and proclaiming Islamic law to be supreme. There's also been the non-aligned movement with the Jakarta message in 1992 and the Bangkok Declaration in 93, which were variants on these, statements that affirmed the importance and universality of human rights but pressed for non-interference, priority for economic rights, respect for cultural differences, and greater emphasis on duties than rights. So there are these precursors, and there is continuity with developments in the past. But none of these developments really gained much of a foothold, and there wasn't the kind of coordination and the transnational reach of these movements that I think I've seen in recent times. China's stance on non-interference and so on, it mightn't have changed much, but its proactive policy of mobilising has changed a lot, and it's being much more proactive about propagating this vision and arguing for support for it in international institutions. And at the same time, while reproductive rights have always been controversial, I think that the extent to which there are alliances with a real playbook, they're all following the same playbook, so there's an interchange of ideas. They meet regularly in international fora. So one global alliance is called the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which is trying to reshape a new human rights movement. There are meetings in the World Congress of Families, in even the US Conservative Action Conference, CPAC, travelled last year to Budapest for its meeting and met with Fidesz to discuss issues including anti-gender ideology and the need to limit LGBTQ activism and the importance of a coordinated transnational movement. So this is not just happens, and these are not just random events in different parts of the world. And similarly, China's strategy is much more, I think, deliberate, thought through, and insistent in recent times, particularly in its institutional approach to really sort of promote itself and its nationals through leadership positions in international human rights bodies. So then, if you follow me that far, that's what's happening is something distinctive and is different, even if it has some continuity with previous developments. Are human rights not open to this kind of reinterpretation and change anyway? I mean, that might just be an argument. Why not? Can we really insist human rights always have to be progressive? Can't there be a conservative human rights movement? So this is a more difficult claim, but I think one that it's very important to respond to. So human rights principles are open-ended. They're by definition, they're rather broad and open-ended in the way they're framed. And there is significant room for debate and legitimate interpretation in multiple directions, some more progressive and some more conservative than others. But the claim I'm trying to make is that there are certain core commitments of the international human rights system, which despite the room for challenge and contestation over this or that right and so on, that there's a kind of a bedrock underneath that room for contestation and change. And the fundamental core commitments of the system are such that if we're not committed to those anymore, then what we're talking about isn't human rights anymore. It's something else. It's not the international human rights system as it was created, developed, and has thickened over 7 decades. So just as a Potemkin village looks like a village but is not designed for people to live in, no one lives there. It's designed to deceive the observer. It's a mocked-up hollow. My argument is that if human rights, what is calling itself human rights and promoting itself as a human rights system, doesn't actually adhere to these basic core commitments, then it's not a human rights system. So you don't need to adopt a thick moral or political theory of human rights to follow my argument through to this. The basic commitments I'm talking about are recognition and protection for the equal human dignity, human freedom and human welfare of all persons, and the commitment to state accountability for the recognition and protection of human rights. Those are the kind of bedrock principles. And those commitments have been explicit not only in the founding texts of the human rights system, the post-World War II text, but also through the complicated, messy, contested, pluralist system that we have. They're central in all of the elaborations we have of different human rights, different rights regimes, in the jurisprudence that's developed them, in the case law, in the articulation of rights by the array of actors that have mobilised to promote human rights. So, in my view, a number of consequences flow from those basic commitments, the commitment to equal human dignity, human freedom, human welfare of all, and a commitment to accountability. So any kind of claims for protection of human rights should be, and I have 5, sort of orientations or precepts. They should be dignity enhancing rather than dignity undermining. They should be recognising rather than denying the equality of all humans. They should be universalist in orientation rather than strictly sovereigntist. In other words, it's not just for the people of this state. Human rights are for humans, not for citizens. They should be welfare promoting rather than welfare reducing. And finally, they should be accepting rather than rejecting mechanisms of accountability. So those are 5, I would say, orientations that any legitimate and genuine human rights claim to a human rights argument should follow. And they're very general orientations, so it might be difficult to assert that any particular argument is wrong or is illegitimate. But to develop the argument further, I'm sort of also going to articulate a number of what I might call indicators. Not any one of these indicators alone, but some collection or number of these indicators together might help us to identify contemporary forms of what I would consider to be illiberal human rights misappropriation. So I'm going to mention 6, which are linked to the 5 sort of orientations I mentioned. So the first is, does a particular human rights claim or interpretation have an exclusionary, repressive or anti-pluralist aim or effect, as opposed to widening inclusion or recognition? Secondly, does a specific interpretation or claim represent a significant departure from existing body and sources of international human rights law, particularly developments post-dating the UDHR, which followed through on the development of that system in multilateral treaties? Or does it attempt to impose some new hierarchy of rights within the framework of rights? Thirdly, is there an attempt to scapegoat certain groups, to identify groups or categories said not to be entitled to the protection of human rights, undermining the universality claim? Fourthly, is there an attempt to impose restrictions on civil society, whether on funding, organisation, activities, resort to strategic lawsuits against public policy, so-called SLAPs, which are increasingly evident across Europe and elsewhere, which are used to silence, to try and impose costs on opponents by powerful actors? Fifthly, is there evidence of subterfuge, camouflage or falsehood, intentional distortions, deliberate polarizations? Those kinds of tactics are often part of these strategies. And finally, and crucially, as I've said before, is there a move to reject or to evade external monitoring or independent mechanisms of accountability? So while no one of these indicators alone is likely to definitively, identify an appropriation of human rights as illiberal or pretextual or transgressing core commitments, some combination of them, I think, clearly present red flags, and should warn of the possibility, and several together, I think, strengthens the probability that that's the case. So if you follow the argument so far and accept the claim that what we're seeing is, in fact, a new form of illiberal misappropriation of human rights, an attempt to reshape the human rights system, a distortion of the international human rights system as it was created and has developed over 7 decades, and not simply a shift to a more conservative and less progressive vision of human rights, and one that's nonetheless still a genuine vision. If you accept my argument that that's not what's going on, but that it's something really distinct and different, what, if anything, can be done? Is there anything that can prevent the takeover of the human rights regime, along with this rising authoritarian wave, to prevent the creation of a Potemkin village that's masquerading as a revamped or reformed human rights system? And maybe this is a note of optimism for Anna, in case you're getting depressed at this stage. A first response is to note that without underestimating the significance of the threat, because I've spent some time trying to convince you that there is a threat, without underestimating the significance of the threat, that so far the system has proven reasonably resilient in the face of these challenges. So Russia's traditional family values agenda, though it's very insistent and has been going on for some time, hasn't gotten too far within the UN system or the European system. China's determination to resist all forms of accountability have met with challenges too. It was dented a little by the highly critical report on the Uyghur people that saw the light of day from the UN Human Rights Commissioner, despite multiple attempts to prevent that report from being published. Russia's veto on the Security Council as a member of the Permanent Five didn't prevent the Human Rights Council from setting up a commission of inquiry on Ukraine, which is currently working there. And that was the first time ever that such an initiative has directly targeted the conduct of a member of the P5. At the same time, the LGBTQ plus rights agenda is continuing to be solidly based in the international human rights system with new instruments, and that's spreading through regional systems and national systems and so on, despite the opposition and the attempts to stop that. And recently, a new right was created, a right to a healthy environment was recognised with the adoption of a UN General Assembly resolution. So those are all on the positive side. The system is not yet collapsing. But by the same token, I think it would be a mistake to underestimate the threat. And I think it's there and it's real. And I don't think, the authoritarian wave has crested by any means. And I think that, the one thing, the only real answer, I'm afraid, to the only bulwark against dramatic backsliding or undermining of the human rights regime is the answer that's always been there to explain the power of human rights, and that is mobilization. Mobilization of people, of civil society, of governments, of individuals, of lawyers, of others. So action and activism on the part of those who care, who believe in the universal and equal human dignity, protection for all, not just for some, who believe in and value accountability, particularly of the politically powerful. But what does mobilization mean? Well, it means lots of different things, but, I think the task falls not just to those who work as human rights lawyers and activists. Those are crucial, but they're only a very small number. It falls to everyone, really, who cares. So governments that invoke human rights, as many governments do, often opportunistically, they need to make sure that their strategies and approaches really are strengthening and not undermining the promotion of a coherent, principled and compelling account of rights and conception of rights. And that means sometimes accepting that rights will come back to bite them and shed light and bring accountability to some of their own failings. And it's, so we need governments, they're at the centre of this, but it's not enough, I think, to rely on governments because they are often unprincipled and self-serving and so on. The reality is that everyone who's concerned to uphold the inheritance of universal human rights, to stand up for those who are oppressed, excluded, marginalised, who don't have a voice or don't have a strong voice, to vote for candidates and governments who actually are taking these values seriously, not just pretending to look behind the language and make sure that what commitments are being put forward are genuine commitments. International institutions are really crucial, and domestic institutions are equally crucial. I think we need both sets of institutions, and I think they depend on political support of governments, and they depend in turn on social support. So it goes all the way down. Our political institutions depend on social support, our international institutions depend on political support. And unless we make sure that the rot doesn't spread, from within, that the people we're voting in, the governments we have, the people being nominated to international institutions are genuine and are committed to these, I think we need to remain very vigilant to avoid complacency and to challenge assertions that we hear, that suggest this is just a slightly conservative turn, these are just reformed conceptions of human rights, and to be really prepared to stand up publicly, for the genuine vision of human rights in whatever venues are available. So I think I will stop there, and I don't know, do I hand over to you, Anna, no? Okay. Okay, great. So Anna tells me I can call on any of you who would like to ask a question. Yeah, I think Paul, yeah.
Yeah, great. Hello? Great. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I'm wondering if there's a way in which the different conceptions that you're describing here represent a view on the one hand of rights as being more collective in origin or in character as opposed to individual. And maybe you could just talk through that, because I sense that maybe the more conservative position may be one that puts a little bit less emphasis on the individual and more on the community. And I'm wondering if I understand that you are coming out against the misappropriation. But in line with that, too, in conjunction with one of the principles that you identified for the purposes of those 6 principles for sort of assessing, and I recognize that they all work together, but I think one of them was basically sort of affirming and broadening. How does one respond to a conservative position that would say one sees the inevitable, inexorable multiplication of rights claiming groups or bases for claims which in some sense could extend almost into infinity. How does one begin to address those kinds of concerns? So there's really one question about collective rights versus individual rights, and is that part of what's going on here? Yeah? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. You know, what I would say is that that's one way of, especially if you focus on, well, it's, you know, this agenda of, you know, sexual rights or, you know, and these are very, you know, considered very individual, but actually, and it's true that the groups that are asserting these make much of, you know, community and family and less the individual and the importance of these groups. You know, the international human rights regime actually gives equal weight in law to collective rights and to, you know, to socioeconomic rights, as well as to individual rights. And in fact, those are often, you know, have to be collectively enforced, not individually enforced. But also, and so, you know, the irony is that in fact, many of those rights are neglected by, you know, liberal states that are more focused on the individual. But nonetheless, both East and West, you know, China, Russia, and the US are equally, you know, under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights committed to, have proclaimed a commitment to the indivisibility of both sets of rights. But the other thing I'd say is that, you know, the populist conservative actors that I'm saying are also very opposed to environmental rights, for example, not interested in rights in the context of climate change and so on. Those are quintessentially group rights, or rights of nature, for example, very much opposed to those. So I don't think it neatly, you know, divides on individual, collective. It's the ones they want to protect and the ones they don't want to protect. But that's true also, of course, of the West too, which has been very selective, many Western countries, and the rights they've wanted to protect. Maybe some parts of Europe do a better job of combining social welfare rights and politically liberal rights. But so I don't think the picture is as simple as that. Group rights for the conservative actors and individual rights for the liberal actors. On proliferation of rights, I mean, that's an argument that's also been made for a long time. And I think, you know, it maybe bites more in the US, where there has been, if you take freedom of expression as the quintessential American right, has been seen as a trump, you know, and a trump means it has to win or defeat other rights. I mean, actually, you know, the international human rights system is quite a weak one, and rights are claims that deserve recognition and, you know, deserve enforcement, accountability, and, you know, a way of being, allowing the claim to be made and pursued. They don't deliver or guarantee a result. You know, so rights are actually, their claims, and their enforcement varies really significantly. So I think the idea, the fear of the proliferation of rights, we have too many and they're all cutting against each other, and, you know, too many people are using these as trumps to set aside other agendas, also kind of mischaracterizes the way rights as politics kind of work. I mean, rights aren't just issues that are brought to court and issue in a judgment. They are mobilizing factors that are behind movements for social justice and all kinds of other, you know, racial justice, environmental justice, and so on. So, you know, the idea of proliferation of rights, to me, is often it's a distraction sometimes, I think, from it's a claim that's made, and it's made on both sides, on left and right, and by progressives and by conservatives alike. But, you know, in my view, I mean, of course, you can trivialize rights, you know, and there's always that risk of coming up with some very flimsy argument and claiming it as a right. But I really do think that so long as we're oriented by the core commitments, then there's a way of testing whether new rights, environmental rights, LGBTQ rights, digital rights, for example, are important. And, you know, to the extent that they really are important to protecting equal human dignity, I think we have a guide for at least knowing what's a genuine right, and what's one that deserves recognition, as opposed to, you know, just another agenda that isn't really, you know, doesn't deserve the name of a right. Oh my goodness, so many. I'll take it. I see Ralph and Alexandra, so I'll take you two, and then.
Gráinne, that's fabulous as always, and fabulously wealthy in the brief time. And in the end, fabulously optimistic, I think, also, despite all, because there's a true vision of human rights in what you say, and there's a false vision, and we can easily say that the false one is a Potemkin village. And so you make a lot of the right-wing attack on human rights, and you make relatively little space for the left-wing criticism of human rights. That is, the right-wing parties that attack often don't come from the right, but they come from what was previously liberal parties. Liberal parties that have turned illiberal, like the FPO in Austria, like parts of the FDP in Germany, like parties in Hungary, etc. So there is something that suggests the risk that the very notion of liberalism turns into illiberalism, and that means also some of the foundation of rights-based views of politics turn into illiberalism. And that would mean that the threat would be inside the idea of human rights to some extent, at least, rather than easily distinguishable. The left-wing critique, of course, suggests that rights are problematic because they carve off spaces, because they tend to depoliticize by turning something into law that should be about politics, that they aspire to some universalism which becomes problematic in an imposition in a pluriversal perspective. So all of those criticisms that you know, and you group together the post-colonial left-wing critiques of the 1990s, some of which are authoritarian, but some of which are clearly on that side. You group those together with the right-wing attack. And I would like to hear more from you about why that criticism is not justified. The criticism that says it's intrinsic in human rights as a concept, as a structure, to invite a kind of authoritarian, anti-liberal use that is made of them.
Yeah, I don't believe that. So the simple answer is I don't believe that critique. I'm obviously very familiar with that. I think there are authoritarian tendencies in the human condition. I think, that the world is divided. I mean, this is long been known. There are cleavages, the ways in which people think. It's been, demonstrated by psychologists and so on. Do move from a liberal to an authoritarian. That is the pole. And, it's not surprising that, in difficult times, often in economically challenging times, that people turn towards that illiberal. Not everyone does, and I think societies are quite divided at the moment. But I don't think it's rights that explains that. I don't find that convincing at all. I mean, if you have a very strongly legalistic rights as Trump's conception, then I can see you might, that becomes an instrument that can turn against the other and against the outsider and so on, and to protect the community. It sort of links a little bit to Paul's first question, but I don't see the intrinsic link myself between rights and liberalism and illiberalism, that one necessarily oscillates into the other. I think there are other factors that explain that. I'm not sure, is that responsive to the...
Well, part, you say you don't believe it. You
don't
tell me why you don't believe it.
Because I think what's motivating those changes is something else in the human condition and not the use of the language of rights. I think, rights can be conceived in all kinds of ways. I don't understand rights, and from the work I've done, many people who are rights activists don't understand rights in the way that the left critics say. They don't see them as some kind of legal trump that you have to go to court for. They see them as things that they as humans want to shout about and go and argue for and mobilize for and so on. So I think there are many different conceptions of rights, and I don't think the conception of rights as expressed in the international human rights system, very thin actually, the UDHR and so on, I don't think it necessarily encapsulates this, the target of the critique of rights, of the left critique of rights. So, I don't know, that's another, maybe a different version of it, but I'm happy to continue the conversation. Okay, Alexandra.
Yeah, it's a special treat to celebrate today on the day of the visit of King Charles, also the visit of one of the foremost Irish origin European lawyers. And just on a personal note, for a young German scholar, German law student who studied in the Irish West in the 1990s and got intrigued by European law and human rights law, this then already towering group of female European law and human rights scholars in Ireland, which Gráinne de Búrca is clearly one of them, has been a great inspiration. But I have two questions. The first goes back a little bit to Lloyd Cutler and his colleagues at WilmerHale, who were in the process of European integration, really a kind of activist lawyers, who Tommaso Pavone recently characterized as the ghostwriters of the process, so really active forces from the non-governmental field. And if we look to Eastern Europe, we see an emerging landscape of NGOs and institutions that are providing strategic litigation and going to the courts, to the ECJ, to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, projects to establish law schools modeled after the model of far-right and religious right law schools in the US that we have seen in the last 2 decades. So how important are these actors? What's your estimation how influential they are, and whether we would need to be more watchful to also have these on target and in our focus?
Can you just mention again, so you said strategic litigators?
Institutions like Ordo Juris in Poland, for example, or institutions in Hungary, which are apparently really largely funded, generously funded by Russian oligarchs, but also by actors from the US. There are transnational networks. And the second question goes to China. You described the conservative populist movement from the religious right and the Chinese movement mostly in parallel, if I got you right. And I would be interested, how does this interconnect? If we remember the Pompeo Commission and the way how the report of the Commission was presented, that was framed clearly also in the context of an anti-Chinese foreign policy agenda. But are there still points where this intersects, and or are these completely unconnected dynamics that we see?
Yeah. So it's harder for me to answer that second one because I haven't seen any of it. They seem quite different in ways, because the presence of religious actors and religious funding and so on in the populist political groupings and so on is very, very evident, and that's not the case, with China. And similarly, the anti-LGBT, anti-gender equality dimension is not really China's interest or issue. As far as I can see, it's much more about control and sovereignty and maybe prioritizing economic development over political freedoms and so on. But, China and Hungary are reasonably, have amicable relations and so on. So it's possible that there could be intersections. I haven't seen them yet, But also, I guess, China does have allies in, on the international institutions when it comes to voting and support and so on. So, any government moving in an authoritarian direction may well have, some more likely to have an alliance there. So it's something to watch out for. On your other question, I think these are very much part of the picture. So it's a little bit like, civil society in Hungary at the moment is kind of, I don't know if you'd quite call them gongos, but government established civil society organizations. So what looks like, and similarly to the national human rights institutions that are often taken over by government, in many countries they stand for an independent human rights body that's another check or balance, but in many states they are controlled by the government, and so they look the same, but they're not. And so I think that's very much, happening at the moment. And the transparency of funding is often difficult to trace, but there are certainly strong alliances between European highly conservative or liberal organizations that are promoting certain rights, family rights or against children's rights and against reproductive rights and against gender equality. And they have even branches, in the US and here. So, and you mentioned them doing strategic litigation. I mean, another thing that I think is interesting and worrying is the extent to which the members of the international institutions, which also used to be a sort of a check and balance in the same way that independent civil society was, are themselves from within, depending on who's being nominated. The Turkish judge on the ECHR, for example, who's very close to Erdogan, or, others, special rapporteurs that have been nominated by China and that are not independent and so on. To the extent to which our independent international institutions become authoritarian from within, I think that also is a massive, weakening of the system, leads to its erosion from within. Yeah, Dilek. I see Dilek and Matthias, and then, colleague over there.
Yeah, Gráinne, thank you very much for this. My question goes to more towards, your comments towards the end, speaking about solutions, the importance of, actors. And I want to sort of zoom in a little bit on Europe and the ECHR and the European Union and how they have been responding to the authoritarian challenge. When you look from, what strikes me really as someone who was, born and raised in an authoritarian regime, that being Turkey, my observation and experience on Europe and European institutions and governments has been some sort of almost a naivete that I observe on their part, that sort of this almost either incapacity or reluctance to recognize autocracies and authoritarians and the threat and to effectively deal with it. And oftentimes what I see is actually sort of these policies of collaboration, cooperation, appeasement, and just utter almost incapacity really to deal with that. And I find that striking. And a few examples just to sort of lay out there. You mentioned, for example, the importance of governments, right? When you look at the ECHR system, you just don't see, for example, the interstate mechanism having been used for the purpose of upholding human rights. Rather, it has been traditionally used in interstate disputes, right? I mean, now recently, in this case that was brought against, by Ukraine against Russia, you see, others join in. But for example, it has never been used to contest Russia's suppression of human rights internally, or Turkey's, right? So that's one example. Or when you look at, you mentioned the shrinking of the civic space, it took the ECHR 7 or 10 years to issue a judgment on the infamous foreign agent law, allowing Russia, in the meantime, to really expand the reach of this. You can say the same about the European Commission, how it has really been unwilling to use its powers to sanction Poland and Hungary, leaving it to the ECJ, or, of course, the EU governments, but particularly German governments, policies towards Russia and Turkey, the energy and the migration deal, etc. So when I look at this picture overall, it's just, I just do not know how we can really trust governments and international institutions themselves, by the way. You mentioned the Turkish judge, but of course, Judge Spano himself, Robert Spano, the president of the ECHR, made this infamous visit to Turkey, which just cannot be explained by, it's just inexcusable. So I don't really see that kind of, I don't have that faith.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to get your reflections on, why do you think we can really have faith in their ability or willingness to actually really tackle with the authoritarian threats?
I'm not sure I have faith that they can. I just think we need them. So I think civil society alone can't do it. Governments alone can't do it. International institutions alone can't do it. It's the interaction of all of these, and so it's a struggle on all fronts. I mean, I agree with you on the ECHR is very, very, very slow. It's a very slow institution anyway, very cautious and big and slow moving. Has been very slow too, and also it's hard to know what kinds of coalitions of votings within the court take place. I think recently the Court of Justice, the EU's court, has been a bit better, a bit sharper, weak in some ways, but it's been exactly the same in the EU. No EU member state has taken an interstate case against one of the illiberal, backsliding, whatever states. They don't do it. States don't confront each other. Governments don't confront each other. They don't want to because they don't want to be the one confronted next and so on. There are all kinds of reasons why they're not the right ones to enforce against each other. Usually an international institution that's independent, it can, and sometimes the smaller ones do. Special rapporteurs can be very good. They don't have power, but they have accountability. They're an accountability forum. They can bring attention to things. They can shame and so on. The Venice Commission has been very good. So you find them. Ombudsman and ombuds offices have been often very good and so it really depends. I don't think all international institutions are captured or weak or all, governments are bad and so on. And also sometimes I think there has been a boiling frog problem where, there hasn't been a real awareness of the extent how serious this is, how the rot has been spreading, honestly, in the EU too. I think the EU's kind of woken up a little bit with the funding conditionality and so on, and because the Commission's a bit less caught, than states or Germany or whatever, it can do a bit more. So I think, it's really important to shore up the independence of international institutions, and it's really, those that have most at stake and care most are the civil society actors, activists, and so on. But they don't have the power to. So you need these, institutions that have some enforcement, some teeth, some funding, some whatever that they can do to bring attention, and ultimately governments to take action. But no, it's not that I think that's the answer. It's just that we need them. Yeah. So I think Matthias, I saw a question over here.
So Ralph Michels put forward the idea that maybe there is something inherent in rights discourse and the structure of rights that could make it susceptible to kind of an authoritarian flip. There's an alternative view, the opposite view, which might suggest that there's something inherent in the notwithstanding the open structure of rights discourse, which is structurally disposed towards patterns of progressive outcomes. I think that's true, and I think it's mostly true because a focus of human rights structurally makes you focus on concrete situations of individual persons and how they're affected, and then imposes a structure of justification on public authorities for doing or abstaining from doing something. And if we move within that type of concrete structure, then I think there are still lots of different positions one might adopt with regard to a particular issue, and there's certainly room for conservative interpretations of rights. But it's no coincidence that genuine non-liberal ideologies, such as a traditionalist nationalist ideology that currently prevails in Russia, or that an ideology of national rejuvenation and overcoming the humiliation of a century of colonialism as in China, it's not a coincidence that these ideologies do not articulate themselves primarily as an alternative rights conception. They articulate themselves using a very different language. So if this is true, then maybe what we should worry about is not so much that there are claims made about rights that happen to be a liberal, conservative, traditionalist, etc. We would want that to happen. We would want to force these actors to articulate themselves using the language of rights. And then they have to meet the counter-arguments, and they have to meet others who will challenge their positions and their arguments that they're putting forward with regard to rights. What is deeply problematic are claims by these actors to move discussions away from human rights-oriented fora into other fora, basically neutralize them, and invoke second-order rules, ultimately assuming the competence of states to interpret rights themselves, and in other words, giving up on the idea of accountability to outsiders. I think that's the dangerous step, because that's about neutralizing human rights talk generally, and that's not the same as making claims about the illiberal meaning of human rights. So I think, with other words, are we really worried about illiberal human rights, or are we worried about the language of rights being subverted by moving it to irrelevance by these actors? I think the latter is a very serious concern, the former not so much, maybe.
Yeah, it would be nice to think you're right, and it's possible that if I think about it, one of the big concerns is the lack of accountability, because when you don't have a genuine external or independent accountability mechanism, these claims can just be made and they may sound convincing, and there's no forum, especially when civil society is silenced and so on. There's no forum for contesting them, and so that the language, the language of rights, even if it's hollow, carries the day, as it were, and the illiberal vision and so on. So it may be that you're right. I'm not so sure. I mean, one of Dilek's colleagues, Bashak Kali, has written about how the European Court of Human Rights itself has all these structures within the rights structure, like margin of appreciation or exceptions or whatever, which just sort of create big holes in and allow for the kind of authoritarian moves that were going on in Turkey for a very long time, so that the language and structure of human rights isn't as safe for progressive human rights outcomes as might be suggested. So I'm not sure if you're right. I mean, it's possible that the structure and language itself is a safeguard of kinds. But I do agree with your second point that most important of all is independent institutions to subject these claims to scrutiny in the light of, the values that are supposedly underpinning these, including universal and equal human dignity, not just for the right community or the right people. I think, there was a question back here. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much. My name's Hugh Williamson. I work for Human Rights Watch, so part of the civil society you've been talking about. It's an extremely interesting talk, and obviously what you've been saying is very much the bread and butter of what we deal with every day in terms of thinking about these issues and trying to find ways through to protect rights in the context that you've been talking about. I'm really pleased that your analysis is that sort of this is a threat, but it's not a threat which is winning, in a sense, is what you're saying. I think from my point of view, it would be useful from a civil society point of view to ask a couple of questions which may help our understanding in civil society, in an organization like mine, sort of navigate this landscape. One question would be, can you say a little bit more about the way the anti-rights organizations are networking, are working together, are cooperating? You said that you gave a few examples, the US organization going to Budapest and so on. That would be helpful to understand that better from a sort of civil society point of view. I think we don't have too much of a very sophisticated understanding of that cooperation. And secondly, you put at the end, you said that sort of mobilization is the key to defending the system and so on. And you also said in the question and answer part about we need to coordinate between civil society, governments, other international institutions and so on. If you could talk a little bit more about that from your perspective, your academic perspective, about how that can be effective, that could be useful for civil society organizations like ourselves. Thank you.
Yeah, the first question is a bit easier than the second. So there are, in a way, my answer is just putting it back on you, which is that this is really important, that I think there is a lot more coordination going on than I had realized. This is a project I started with some colleagues, and we invited people from different countries so that's why we talked about Brazil and Hungary. We looked at India and others. But in Brazil, it was really striking because it's often through religious organizations that the strongest, coalitions are there. So like I mentioned the World Congress of Families, but there are also organizations of bishops, of Catholic lawyers and so on. And they are directly meeting with their counterparts in other jurisdictions. This is not for a public session, I can send you some of the references if that's helpful. But, there's no doubt that, and this came out kind of by happenstance. So each person, the person who was writing about Russia and the Orthodox Church and what it's been doing, and the funders from the US and the coming together of the Christian right. And those, similarly, we had someone looking at 3 jurisdictions in Africa, enormous, patterns of collaboration between Christian right organizations and different religious and government actors, because in some jurisdictions there's no distinction between the religious and the political actors, in others there is, but there are really strong coalitions. And I think what Alexandra mentioned as well, the funding now of these organizations that, we always thought, the Open Society was the funder of strategic action around the world, but there are illiberal counterparts that are working in exactly the same way. And so I think tracking those is, if you've got some research assistants to get onto it, I'd get them onto that, because I think that's a really important part of understanding what's going on. I can certainly, if I get your address, I can send you some of the references that we have. The other is a harder question. It's a very major one, but it's just that in my experience that when I talk about these things, people either are pointing to civil society as they're the key actors with human rights, or governments are the key actors, or then the lawyers think the courts are, or the international human rights systems. And I'm absolutely convinced that it is the coordinated action of, not necessarily coordinated in a formal sense, but the interaction of all of these that creates the human rights system, and in a strong protective one, and that it's not something that any one of them can do alone. So I wrote a book a couple of years ago where I was trying to draw out those patterns of interaction in a number of human rights campaigns, so reproductive rights in Ireland, gender equality in Pakistan, and disability rights in Argentina. And it was really striking how each of them depended on, they weren't getting anywhere through domestic mobilization alone, they weren't getting anywhere just through international courts alone, but the engagement and the different inputs of these different, an international, it could have been a special rapporteur or a court, a judgment, and then the mobilization around that domestically, but also having to use other independent domestic institutions, not just the government. Government would still overlook and avoid and so on, so that there were these really interesting patterns of interaction between all of the different sets of actors. So it's very complicated. It really depends on the issue. But if you had a campaign and there was something you're trying to achieve, I would say you need all of those sets, at least 4 different sets of, of actors. That what the progressive side of the human rights spectrum needs to do is to do what the right is doing, which is very effectively coordinating, coalescing, creating coalitions, networking transnationally. They do it much better and much more coherently and with much more vision than the progressive side of the spectrum, I'm afraid. I think Dieter you had a question also, or Dieter Grimm, sorry, did I see your hand? Sorry.
I never had difficulties in understanding what illiberal democracy is. Because I understood it as a purely majoritarian democracy, which doesn't care about the rights of individuals. I had more difficulties in understanding what illiberal rights are. But what I see from your talk, it is my impression that the most important element perhaps is that rights are disconnected from individuals and are attributed to groups, and protect the identity of groups. And by doing this, they are no longer universal, but they are particular. And as particulars, they can no longer be liberal because they reduce the overall liberty in a society, because they are prohibited. As protections of groups, they prohibit you from a free discourse. For instance, this is one example of the identity and the consequences of these groups. So the general standard of liberalism is decreased. Is this a right interpretation of what you said?
Well, not exactly, in the sense that that group rights and the protection of the rights of groups is a part of the human rights system. It's just not to the exclusion of the rights of individuals. In other words, they have to all live together. You can't say, yes, we protect the rights of the Christian populists or of Hungarians, but not the rights of, yes, we protect the rights of Christians and of Hungarians. We also protect the rights of refugees who are here seeking asylum, or we also protect the rights of people who are not Christian, or, so in other words, it's the exclusion, it's the protection of group rights to the exclusion of individual rights, or the protection of individual rights to the exclusion of group rights, which, some liberal democracies have done. Just to say the illiberal democracy oxymoron is that, the argument anyway, which I firmly believe, is that there is no such thing, because there's no such thing as a purely majoritarian democracy unless you allow independent institutions and alternative political parties and a media that's reasonably free, so that the election can be free and fair. And in most of the illiberal democracies like Hungary, they get rid of all the independent institutions. So not protecting rights and other independent institutions means you have an election, but you have nothing else. And that election, after a while, doesn't become, it's not a real democracy, because without a free opposition and the possibility for other platforms to argue against the government and hold them to account, and without the protection of the rights of groups within society, that it's not. So that's the argument, that an liberal democracy undermines itself and hollows itself out. There's another. Oh,
from Zoom first.
Oh, okay, sure.
You mentioned the Catholics a few answers ago. The question is about the U.S., and Susan Dickey asks, would you agree that in the USA, liberal human rights has succumbed to irrational medieval Catholic natural law, and also by the Christian evangelicals, which, as foreseen in the 1980s, saw the value in aligning with conservative Catholics to legislate their own rigid moral agendas?
Well, some of what I'm describing, I guess, is... maybe that's what Ralph is saying, is that, rights are so easily taken over and used, by left, by right, if they're seen in this way. But, you know, I guess and yes, religious groups, including Catholics in Ireland also for many years, have had very extreme and very exclusionary and very radical sort of views about what is to be protected and what's not to be protected. And, that's been the case in the US also, and it's happening again at the moment. But again, to me, that's as likely to happen. It's not rights that's causing these extreme positions to be held. A strong or a view of rights as a trump that excludes others certainly can be used by illiberal groups and by religious groups that have an exclusionary agenda, for sure. So yeah, I mean that certainly has happened. But I'm not sure.
It hasn't succumbed.
So who's? I'm sorry, I missed that. Who has succumbed?
Liberal human rights has succumbed.
Liberal human rights. I mean, I have maybe, and it's fair enough if the audience feels this. My conception of human rights is a very plural, sort of dynamic one, which does start from and uses as its reference point the positive law system that was created after the 1950s, and that to me is a really vibrant one. When I look at and my colleague in Amnesty might agree, but when you look at what activists are doing and claiming and what's happening with indigenous rights and environmental rights and young people striking for Fridays and so on, there's incredible energy and activism in the liberal human rights movement. There's also attempts, and that's what I'm describing here, on the part of groups to appropriate it and use it as a tool to follow a particular agenda which excludes many others. And to me, that's the antithesis of the universal, indivisible, open, plural human rights system. So I don't think the rights system has succumbed, but I think certainly a certain conception of how you might use rights in this sort of weapon-like way has been used by religious groups in not all and not at all times, but at some times and in some parts of the world.
Thank you. So I'm Hiroshi Motomura, UCLA School of Law. So I have a question that may seem naive, but I think it's important to ask. If I look at what you're saying from a reasonable a height of 50,000 feet or 15,000 meters, whatever it is, what you're describing is something that I think is familiar in the history of ideas, and that is that there are areas of contest, institutions and rhetoric and concepts emerge to address that, that they are initially resisted, that they gain traction, and then it becomes much more natural, easier, and expedient to try to, as you put it, misappropriate that language, and then there's a pushback to that. And so we've seen this time and time again, right? We've seen this in the language of anti-discrimination. We've seen this in the language of environmentalism even. I just saw the title of an article called "We're All Textualists Now." And I'm wondering if what you're describing you see as different to what degree in this area in human rights as opposed to a dynamic that we've seen in many other contexts over history. Without knowing what context exactly you have in mind, it's not an easy. It's not. Those are just examples, right? I'm just trying to figure out the trajectory here. That is, I'm not sure it's uniquely in human rights as much as it is in the currency the ideas have in social contest. Yeah. So they can be used by. So I took very different examples, right, of environmentalism, textualism, and anti-subordination, anti-discrimination, and human rights. And so, I'm just trying to figure out if your part of your argument is this different, or if it's something. I think it doesn't diminish the claim to say it's the same. No. Sure. But
no, I was just trying to get a better sense of what the other examples you have in mind. I think I have a sense of what you mean. I don't know. Is it different? I think the human rights system is a much thicker system in some ways, maybe than some of those that you're describing, in that it has a whole set of institutions, political, social and legal institutions, a jurisprudence. It's a little more, a little thicker, if that's the word. I don't know, because I need to hear more about what environmentalism you have in mind. Is it the theory of textualism or whatever? So all language and all movements and so on can, everything can be a vessel for, movements on the left, on the right and so on. I think the international human rights system is that's why I tried to start with it, it's not, no system is, all systems fail and so on at all times, but it's a fairly thick one, it's a fairly robust one, and a lot has developed around it, and that might be one of the reasons why even, movements and groups and political actors who would really not share the sort of the vision of the vast part of that kind of body of law and practice and policy and so on, want to use it because it's in currency and it's popular and so on. Do I think it's different? It might be. I mean, I'm not a prophet, but I do think that there's an interesting feature about human rights, which is that they remain incredibly resilient at a social level. The idea of rights, we humans have rights, and it can mean all kinds of different things, but it's not quite as open textured maybe as textualism or something else like that. That it stands for something and has quite a substantial body of practice behind it. That might change, and so part of what I'm saying in this is that, we do see, we're in the context of another big historic change politically and so on globally, and it will be interesting to see. My hope would be that there is enough in the idea of human rights that is stickier and more resilient than some of these others, which have proved more of a kind of a vessel for very different types of movement. Maybe, I don't know if Ralph would agree, I doubt it, but I would be hopeful, but not sure. There's lots more hands. What should I do, Anna? I think you have two more. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, hello. I'm working for a human rights organization as well, so one of these civil society actors, and sometimes I ask myself a rather philosophical questions on the wording of human rights, because as we know, we have observed shrinking spaces. We observe that a minority of countries you could label democracies or countries which, in my liberal understanding of democracy, fulfill some certain standards of human rights. And I'm wondering sometimes why even the illiberal approach to human rights never tries to maybe replace even the term human rights. What's the actual attraction? Why the Orthodox Declaration of Human Rights still wants to use the term expression human rights? Why actually the Chinese approach still wants to use the expression human rights if actually the authoritarians are a majority? This, from a very practical human rights activist perspective, I ask myself, what is actually the attraction? What's your assessment of this?
I mean, it may be the same answer as to the previous speaker, which is that there's it's very institutionalized, so there's a whole set of, institutions, and it has a currency that's still strong and so on, and that it's another useful, but I do agree with you that it sometimes seems such a misfit. The distortion is quite, strong and very evident and so on, so it makes it more difficult. And maybe, I mean, if I were optimistic again, it would be that, well, maybe because they recognize that this has some greater, deeper appeal, and that there is always, a resistance. And within even authoritarian systems, there's often, a pushback and a gradual sort of uprising and so on. And within other societies, there is often a mobilization around a new issue in terms of rights, understood as something key and important by virtue of being human and so on. So that maybe it is the attraction and appeal of that. I don't know. Or the institutionalization, or it's just there. And it also, there is a legitimacy to it. I mean, the same way that authoritarians aren't using these days as much military force. Some are, but many aren't. Many are using these legal vehicles and so on as well. So taking over, this kind of apparatus and language of rights and so on, maybe. But you're right. It is puzzling sometimes, I would like to think it's that because these are actually quite powerful ideas underneath it, and they recognise that. But I hope that they will fail as a result of the misfit that you describe. Yeah. There was a question in front, yeah, here. Yeah.
Yes, I would like to hear your opinion about the emergence of social media and artificial intelligence when it comes to human rights. Do you think that they would become a tool to empower human rights or perhaps to weaken them? Maybe none of us have an answer to this question, but it would be nice to listen to your opinion.
I tend, so some people have a very dystopian view about technology and what it can do, and others very utopian. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think it's transformative. It's the issue of our era. It's fundamentally transformative, and I don't know how it's going to affect human rights. I know that it has enabled all kinds of, activism and so on. I know that it has enabled all kinds of surveillance and control and so on. And so it's a transformation. It's a technology of great power and great opportunity for all sides. And, again, whether or not ultimately it can be on the balance on the positive side of the ledger, I think is a really difficult one. It's a very difficult one to say, I think, and we're only just sort of seeing the start of this now, and I think it's going to change even more, radically and transformatively. So on that, I'm afraid I wouldn't hazard a guess. Okay.